to the Coders Campus podcast, where you'll learn how to code from one of the best teachers in the industry. Whether you're an absolute beginner or a seasoned pro, the Coders Campus podcast will teach you what you need to know to master the art of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Ladies and gentlemen, fellow coders, welcome to this 26th episode now of the Coders Campus podcast. Thanks so much for joining. In today's episode, lesson, whatever you want to call it, we're diving into something that may be familiar for most of you. So this may just come as review, but in any case, we're diving into sort of the control structures area of the JavaScript language. Specifically, today we're going to be talking about the if statement. So like I said, if you have any background in Java at all, then the syntax for the JavaScript if statement is going to look very familiar. In fact, it is identical. So if you feel like you are very comfortable with writing if statements in Java, then you might be able to just skip this episode. If not, if you just want to, stick around, listen to the episode, and get some good review, then by all means. So first of all, what is an if statement, right? An if statement is what I call a control structure. I don't call it that. The general smarty pants people who have created programming in general call this a control structure because it represents the modification of what's called the flow of execution of the code in your program. You're modifying the flow. So typically speaking, the code you write will be executed, more or less from top to bottom and left to right. That's sort of the generic or general flow of any code, top to bottom, left to right, for the most part. Obviously, there are exceptions to that rule. But yes, in any given situation, you can expect that the code will flow at least from top to bottom. So this means that if you write 10 lines of code, it'll execute each line of code one by one from line 1 to line 10. So if we had a whole bunch of, in the JavaScript language, to do like a system out, the equivalent of a system out in Java, or rather the equivalent of system out from Java in JavaScript is called the console.log. So you're logging something to the console, which I think makes a whole lot more sense than system.out. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. So in JavaScript, they call it console.log. So you can have, let's say you had 5 lines of code, console logs, saying I'm the first line of code, I'm the second line of code, third line, fourth line, fifth line, all on different lines of code as console logs. You're going to get an output of, on the console, you're going to see I'm the first line of code, I'm the second line, third line, fourth line, fifth line. So it's just going to, appear one by one in the order that it is typed in. So hence top to bottom, as you would have expected. Now, like I mentioned, the concept of control structure is to modify the flow of the code. So this it can mean that you can mess with the default sort of top to bottom ordering or top to bottom flow of the code. Of course, this modification of the code isn't random at all. Okay, it's chosen specifically by you, the programmer. You are telling the computer how you want the code to flow, because it's obviously not just going to say, "Oh, I feel like going to line 5 right now," because then that's just absolute chaos. So, you can use different kinds of control structures to modify the flow of your code, but in this case, we're going to be focusing on the if statement and how we can use the if statement to modify that flow. So essentially how an if statement works in JavaScript is that it's made up of 3 parts. It's made up of the if keyword, if. If you don't know what an if statement is, then, well, keep listening. The second part of it is the condition itself. That is sort of wrapped inside of the round brackets. So the condition has to equate to either true or false. There needs to be some sort of evaluation. It needs to evaluate to either true or false. And then you have the scope of the actual if statement. So knowing that you'll need to use the if keyword is hopefully, like I said, pretty straightforward. I'll fly on through that part and talk about the next one, which is the condition. An if statement requires you to have a condition. Like I said, this is the fundamental aspect of the if statement. There needs to be some sort of a question, right? So it needs to be evaluated, where the answer is either true or false. Right? Makes perfect sense. At least if you've done if statements before, it makes perfect sense. If you haven't, then, well, this is going to be new to you, and this is exactly how if statements work. So if you structured your condition to be a true or false question, then you must outline then the scope of your if statement. Okay, so once you got the true or false answer going, the next step is the scope. So by scope, I mean how much of your code will be affected by the if statement. So you see, if an if statement's purpose is to skip a certain number of lines of code, hence modifying the flow of the code, when the condition is false, then that's exactly what it does. This means that the if statement, if the question asked inside the if statement returns false, then the JavaScript engine will skip all the lines of code that are contained within the scope of that if statement. Okay, that's the purpose of scope, saying either if the statement is true, then go ahead and execute the stuff inside of the scope of the if statement. If the if statement resolves to false, evaluates to false, then you're going to skip every single line of code inside of the scope of that if statement. So that's how the if keyword, the condition, and the scope all sort of work together in tandem to make this a control structure, flow modification type keyword in the Java or JavaScript language. So let's talk a little bit about the syntax of JavaScript. I kind of flew by that stuff because I'm assuming most people are familiar with this stuff and want to just get to the syntax. So let's assume that you want to modify the previous code that we talked about where we had the 5 lines of code such that it will not output the first piece of text. In other words, you want to omit the first sentence which says, I'm the first line of code. How do we do this? Well, before we can write our code, we need to determine what our condition is actually going to be. Right? Remember, that's the second part of the 3 parts of the if statement. The second part is the condition. So in this case, let's keep things simple and base our condition around the Boolean variable called show first line. Okay, so the show first line Boolean variable will have either true or false assigned to it, hence it being a Boolean variable. Again, referring back to previous episodes, JavaScript, we don't assign the Boolean, we don't assign data types. The data types are assigned for us in the background. The JavaScript engine handles that for us. So in any case, in our example that we're going to be talking about, we'll set this particular variable to false because we want it to skip the first line of code. So the code will be var show first line equals false, semicolon. Okay, var is how we, say that we're going to declare a variable. Show first line is the name of our variable. It's created in camel case, so important to note that it uses the same sort of naming conventions as the Java language. Camel case meaning the first word is lowercase, and then starting with the second word, the first letter of the second word is uppercase, the rest is lowercase, and then the first letter of the next word is uppercase, and the rest is lowercase, and then the first letter of the next one is uppercase, and the rest is lowercase. You get the idea. That's camel casing. So we have var show first line equals false, semicolon. Then we have our if statement. So we say if, open round bracket, show first line equals true, close round bracket. So the condition here is we're saying with the double equals means we are not setting a value like we did before in the first line of code where we said show first line equals false. When you say equals, you're asking a question. The question is, does the stuff on the left equal the stuff on the right? That's what happens when you use a double equal. So in JavaScript, or in Java, we have a double equal. So this is the same kind of concept in JavaScript. So very, very familiar stuff if you've used Java before. Show first line double equals true. So that means, is show first line equal to true? Yes or no? So that will evaluate the condition. The condition is inside of the round brackets. And then we assign the scope of the if statement. So in order to assign scope, you open a curly bracket. Okay, just like we have scope inside of the Java language, we use the curly bracket to define scope inside of the JavaScript language. So we open our curly bracket, and then we put our console.log statement saying, I'm the first line of code, and then we close the curly bracket. So the scope of the if statement it encompasses just that one console log statement saying, I'm the first line of code. So that's the scope of the if statement, just that one console.log piece of code. So fair enough, right? So now we have this if statement and this Boolean value set to false. So what happens? Well, the program is going to start off by looking at the first line of code and saying, okay, show first line equals false. So it's going to assign false to show first line, the variable. And then what's going to happen is it's going to hit the if statement and it's going to evaluate the condition. Does show first line equal true? Yes or no? Well, the answer here is going to be no. So it's not true. It's false. So what happens is since it's false, it's going to skip all of the scope of that if statement, which I said wrapped around the first console.log statement, right? So it's going to skip the first console.log statement. It's going to go right to the next line of code below the end of the scope of the if statement, which in this case, the next line of code is I'm the second line of code. So therefore, the output is going to be I'm the second line of code, the third line of code, the fourth line of code, the fifth line of code. So it's not going to print out I'm the first line of code because our if statement has evaluated to false and therefore it skips it. Now, consequently, if you had assigned the value of true to that show first line variable, then it would output the first line of code. Very, very straightforward stuff. All right, having seen or talked about the basic if statement, let's get a bit more advanced and talk about the if-else. This condition or this concept is very common inside all programming languages that have if statements, which I assume all of them would, except for maybe if you're talking about, assembler type languages and stuff like that, early languages that use like go-to statements and stuff. But anyway, the if-else statement was created for the times when you have more than two possible outcomes for a specific question. Right? In our previous question, there's really just two outcomes, true or false. But, because there's only one condition that we're trying to match against true or false. If there's more than one condition, then this is where it's helpful to have multiple sort of if statements inside of an if-else structure. So in the case of the example above, like I said, we had two possibilities, true or false. And this was the case because we're just using a single Boolean variable. So now let's use a variable that has more than one outcome, like let's say a number. Okay, how about we write some code that will only output a single sentence from our example program, right? So let's write it so that you have to enter a number from 1 to 5 that represents which sentence we wish to see. So if the variable is set to 1, it will output on the first line of code. If the variable is set to 3, then it'll output on the third line of code, the fourth line of code, that kind of thing. Make sense? So we would just write it with, we can create a new variable called line to show, right? And it's going to have a number assigned to it, 1 through 5. So if the line to show, we'll set it as being equal to 1, let's say. So we'll say var line to show equals 1, semicolon. Then we can say if line to show equals 1, so we're asking the question, does it equal 1, yes or no? Then we can print out the console.log on the first line of code. We close the curly bracket because the scope of that if statement only represents this, only wraps just the console.log, the first statement. Then we have an else if. 2 words, all lowercase, else if. And then we have in our round brackets again the next condition. So it's the if statement structure. The if is exactly the same structure. It's just we have an else in front of the word if. That's the only change that happens here. So you still write the if statement as normal. It's just we have an else in front of it. So then we have line to show equals number 2 or double equals 2. We have console.log on the second line of code, and that's wrapped in curly brackets, and so on and so forth. Else if line to show double equals 3 inside of round brackets for that condition. Then we have curly brackets and console.log on the third line of code. Blah 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 blah. All this is going to be available if you want to check out this code at the coderscampus.com/26 because this is the 26th episode, so you can see all this code if you like. And then finally, the very last statement, what I've chosen to do is just have an else statement. So we really have an if, else flow going on here. So the last else is the catch-all that says, okay, if all of the other conditions evaluate to false, then by default you're going to execute this particular scope. Okay, so the else, it just says else with brackets. Again, if you've done this in Java, then you're very familiar with this stuff. So there you go. So inside of the else statement, I just put the last line of code saying console.log, I'm the 5th line of code. And I even put another console.log statement saying we're done, just to show that we've hit the end of the if, else structure. So, make sense? So then what happens when we run that code? Well, when we run the code, it's just going to say, I'm the first line of code, and then we're done. And the reason why it says I'm the first line of code, and that's it, other than we're done, is because we've assigned the value of 1 to the line to show variable. If we had assigned number 2, it would have said, I'm the second line of code, and then we're done. If you assigned 3, it would have said, I'm the third line of code, and then we're done. You get the idea, okay? So that is how you write out the if, else structure, and, how it works. Again, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of, how exactly an if, and else structure executes exactly from line to line, because I think I've already talked about that in the earlier versions of this podcast, at least the How to Program with Java podcast. I talked about this. So, I'd recommend going there. Or you can go to, like I said, the show notes, and you can read exactly about it, because I think I write about it in my little write-up. I have some, in-depth explanations as to what's going on, as well as, a visual explanation as to how the JavaScript engine will sort of flow from line to line to line. So it's, I try my best to show as visual representation as possible, as, exactly what you would see if you were debugging. And you would see that line, you said, go to the next line of code, go to the next line of code. It would be skipping through and executing the lines individually. So I try my best to show you a visual representation of that. Okay, so there you go. If statements are extremely common in the programming landscape, especially the JavaScript language as well, it's definitely no exception to that rule. If you're having trouble understanding how this stuff works, even after you've checked out the show notes page at coderscampus.com/26, well, then I would say you probably need a bit more help when it comes to your learning process. So obviously, this is where something like the Coders Campus would come into play and be very helpful. I spoke about this lifetime access thing in the last episode. If you missed it, you can get lifetime access to Coders Campus, which is literally every single course I've ever made and every single course I will make that relates to learning how to program. Okay, so in the current iteration, as of right now, today, as I'm recording this, there's 15 different courses, and there's new lessons added every week, and there will be new courses added, every probably month or every 2 months as I go through and create the videos. So it'll give you access to all that stuff and all the future stuff I'll make related to learning how to program for one fee, if you will, one investment, one price of $297. Or 3 payments of $99 if you don't have that one lump sum. I'm trying to make this the absolute best deal I can possibly make it in terms of the monetary value. I know some of you can't afford that kind of stuff. It sucks. I know, I get it. But this is, I have to run a business, right? I have to be able to, put a roof over my head, my wife's head, and my soon-to-be kid's head. So this is, the way it is. This is how, what I can do to give back to you is do these for free, right? I do these podcasts for free. But if you really want to help support these podcasts and keep them free, one thing you can definitely do is sign up to the Coders Campus. So you can go to coderscampus.com/lifetime to check out that lifetime access deal. It's $297 right now. I might need to raise the prices in the future. I don't know. Again, this is also a test. We're just going to see how this works out. More than likely, what will end up happening is a lifetime deal will stick around, but the prices will go up. So if you're listening to this right now, the price is $297. If you're listening to this in the future, I cannot guarantee it'll be $297 forever. So anyway, I don't want to pressure you into anything that you don't need to be pressured into, but that is just the honest truth of the matter. The prices might be going up in the future. So check it out. coderscampus.com/lifetime gives you access to all of those courses, and definitely it includes a JavaScript course that goes into depth and gives you many, many hours of video tutorials as well as tests, assignments, and a private Facebook group. So if you do get stuck, you can reach out in the private Facebook group, get help from either myself or someone else inside of the community. All right. Check it out, coderscampus.com/lifetime or coderscampus.com/26 for the show notes for this episode. So thanks so much for listening. It's always a pleasure to have you join me, broadcast into your earbuds or your car stereo or your iPhone or your whatever it is, wherever you're listening. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you guys, and it's really an honor to have you guys listen in on these podcasts. It reaches thousands and thousands of people. And yeah, it's an incredible feeling to be able to have access to all of you guys and girls and to help you out in your journey of learning how to code. So hopefully my passion comes out when it comes to learning how to program. I love this stuff, even if it's just as simple as talking about an if statement. So thank you so much for joining. I will let you go by saying take care of yourself, happy learning, and bye for now.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coders Campus podcast. But before you go, Trevor has a favor to ask you. In order to keep these episodes free, he'd love for you to leave a rating and review the podcast on iTunes. Just go to coderscampus.com/review to leave your own rating and review of the show. So if you have 30 seconds to spare right now, please help out by leaving a rating and review via coderscampus.com/review. It will ensure that you continue to get these awesome free podcast episodes each and every week. So if you like free swag, head on over to coderscampus.com/review. Happy learning!